I think China's growth path has been remarkable, but it's also one that's very difficult to understand. I think a starting point for understanding it is that China is an economy in transition from central planning into a more market-based economy, but it's also a developing country that only reached middle income status about a decade ago, and that's at 3,000 US dollars per capita, adjusted for purchasing power. So in other words, it's a relatively underdeveloped country that has a centrally planned economy that's being dismantled, while at the same time they're trying to improve the industrialization and evolving into services process that every developing country goes through. So with these two challenges, China is almost an unlikely candidate for economic success, and yet it's become the world's second biggest economy. It's lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and the way it's done it is a, well, unsurprisingly complicated process. There has been injection of incentives into parts of the economy that were previously planned. There has been liberalization, a gradual opening up to the global economy, and all of these steps have slowly taken China in what we describe as a gradualist transition from what was a rather poor country into a prosperous one. But the path, even if you went through all of these reforms, the path ahead still requires a number of challenges, which is why, even though China's had remarkable success, there are open questions about whether or not China can do something which has never been done for a country which accounts for 1/5 of the world's population, which is to become prosperous, overcome the middle income country trap, where a country becomes middle income like China and yet never becomes wealthy. That's what's happened to most of the middle income countries in the world. It's not unusual for a middle income country to slow down. So when China slows down to a growth rate of around 7% or 6.5% or so, that shouldn't be surprising, because if you look at rich countries, it's very unusual to be able to grow by, say, more than 3%. Europe hasn't seen those kinds of growth rates in a really long time. So rich countries grow more slowly than poor countries, and that's because rich countries, when they grow, they need to push up the technology frontier. So they need to be innovative, they need technological improvements, and that's not easy to do, whereas developing countries are largely catching up to the technology frontier. So as China grows and becomes more developed, it's going to slow down, but the challenge is not to slow down so much that it never achieves prosperity. So that hinges on being innovative and technologically advanced, and that's an open question as to how any country could produce the kinds of life-changing innovations, technologies, the kinds of things that have changed our lives, like smartphones or how the internet is used, and rival that of Western economies. And I think there are Chinese companies which have pushed through the global barrier, but obviously China is a big place, and it's still very early days in terms of them getting to that level of innovation. And if they can, then they can have a much better chance of sustaining their growth and becoming prosperous. But that challenge of reform while slowing down is a considerable one. There are Chinese companies which are increasingly globally competitive, but I think probably there aren't enough of them. So in other words, as a country begins to emerge onto the global scene, the best test of how innovative they are is how competitive their companies are. And you saw it with Japan, with South Korea. And there are Chinese companies that are amongst the top global companies. For instance, Huawei is the world's biggest telecoms company. They operate in 1/3 of the world's countries. Alibaba had the biggest initial public offering in New York. Baidu, Tencent, Lenovo, ZTE, some of these are among the top patent filers in the world. So there are Chinese companies that in the last decade, because the government is trying to promote more innovation, were allowed to go global and invest overseas. And we are increasingly seeing more Chinese outward investment creating Chinese multinational companies. And if there were enough of these companies that were able to sell their products to global markets and compete with Western companies, I think that's a very good sign that China can be an innovative major economic power.